Roland looked at me from the living room doorway and said, "It was nothing. It's handled. We are not blowing up our lives over this." He said it in the flat, certain tone he had always used when a conversation was already over in his mind. The tone that assumed I would receive the decision he had already made and fold it into my understanding of things, the way a letter gets slid under a door. Delivered, accepted, done. He was standing in the entrance to the living room. One shoulder leaned against the frame, and his expression carried the particular confidence of a man who had talked his way out of consequences before and found no reason to believe this time would be different. I was holding the credit card statement. I set it on the table between us, very precisely, aligned the edge with the edge of the table. Then I looked at him and said, "All right." I went back upstairs. I sat in the hallway of our bedroom for a moment, and then I sat in the closet doorway, looking at the fireproof document box on the shelf, the one I had put there 8 years ago and had not touched since, the one with the blue cover page folded behind the binder clip on top. What Roland did not know, what he had not thought about in 8 years, possibly had not thought about once, was page 4. The marital estate was $6.1 million. The clause on page 4 moved $2.1 million of it. He had signed it. I had written the plain language summary of it myself, at my attorney's request, because I was a technical writer and the language needed to be exact. He had not read it since the day he signed. Good day, dear listeners. It's Ren again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say that the people who get blindsided are the ones who weren't paying attention. Have you ever believed that? I did, once. But I have spent 15 years proving the opposite is true. The people who get blindsided are not the careless ones. They are the ones who assume that everyone around them reads the same way they do. Quickly, carefully, and with retention. They sign what they sign and trust the other party understood it the same way. They never imagine that one person at the table has read the document and one person has not. Do you know what happens when you sign something you haven't read? I do. I have spent 15 years writing the translations, the plain language summaries, the consumer disclosures, the regulatory documents that financial institutions are required to give you before you commit to anything. I write those documents so that ordinary people can understand what they're agreeing to. So the language is not a barrier. So the terms are clear, specific, and enforceable. The law is not interested in what you meant to understand. It is interested in what the document says, what your signature confirms. I understood that before Roland and I ever met. I understood it more precisely after we married. And I understood it with a particular clarity on a Tuesday in February, standing in the living room of our Charleston house, with a credit card statement in my hand and a man in the doorway who believed that 3 sentences, delivered in the right tone, could close the matter. He was wrong about that. He was wrong in a way that cost him $2.1 million. But I am getting ahead of myself, and these things deserve to be told properly, from the beginning. Roland and I married on a Saturday in October, 11 years ago. The wedding was small and held in the garden of a friend's house in the South of Broad neighborhood, the old part of Charleston, where the houses are narrow and deep and the air carries salt and old brick in all seasons. We moved into our own house in that neighborhood 3 months later. It was a historic Charleston single, 1 room wide, several rooms deep, with a piazza running the full length of the 2nd floor that looked out over the side garden. The kind of house that asks something of you constantly. Maintenance and attention and care, We were, for several years, the people who gave it those things willingly and in partnership. I worked from home. My home office occupied a small room at the back of the house on the second floor, overlooking the garden. In autumn and winter, it caught the particular low gold afternoon light that Charleston offers in those months. I had worked as a freelance technical writer for 15 years, specializing in financial services documentation, loan agreements, consumer disclosure statements, regulatory compliance materials, the documents that banks and mortgage servicers are legally required to provide before anyone signs anything significant. I read contracts the way other people read menus, quickly with attention, expecting to find things worth noting. My name is Frederica. I was 43 years old at the time of these events. I am the kind of woman who does not perform much emotion in front of other people, not because the emotion is absent, but because the performance has never seemed useful. I am precise, I am patient, and I observe things carefully. I notice rhythms. I notice when a rhythm changes. I keep things in labeled boxes, including documents, including things I hope never to need. Roland managed a commercial insurance brokerage he had inherited from his father, a well-regarded firm, mid-sized, with a client base built over 3 decades that Roland had maintained and modestly grown. He was 47. He was charming in the way that requires upkeep, the kind of social ease that had been practiced and refined until it looked like nature. He was good at managing rooms. He was good at managing conversations. He was very good at the confident delivery of a conclusion that assumed it would be accepted, and it had been accepted, often enough that he had mistaken this pattern for a law. We had a good marriage. I want to be honest about that. For the first several years, we had a genuine partnership. Two people who liked each other and had built a shared life with real structure and real warmth. We were not a performance of a couple. We were, for a time, the real thing. The trouble was that the real thing had one incident. 3 years in, I did not announce the incident to anyone. Not to my friends, not to my family, not to Roland's family, who I had come to know well and genuinely liked. I addressed it directly and quietly, with Roland, in a single long conversation that I had prepared for the way I prepare for a significant client meeting, knowing what I needed to say, knowing what I needed to hear, and knowing what conditions would need to be met for me to continue. One of those conditions was the postnuptial agreement. Roland agreed to it. He had been, in that moment, in a position where agreeing was the only path available to him that did not immediately end the marriage, and he had taken it. We both retained independent legal counsel. We executed the agreement on a Thursday morning in April, 8 years before our divorce. The agreement was 12 pages long, bound with a binder clip, and covered with a blue cover page that Imogen had printed in her office. I kept my copy in the fireproof document box in the bedroom closet, on the upper shelf to the right. I had written the plain language summary at Imogen's request, a 2-page document that translated each clause into ordinary language, the way I do professionally, so that both parties could demonstrate clear understanding of what they were agreeing to before they signed. My name appeared in the header of that summary as the author. Roland had read it. He had asked 2 questions, both of which I answered. Then he had signed both documents, the agreement and the summary, and he had not thought about them again. I had thought about them. Not obsessively, not with dread. But the document box was there, on the shelf, and I knew what was in it, the way you know the location of a first aid kit, not because you expect disaster, but because it is useful to know. The first thing I noticed, in the months before the credit card statement arrived, was a rhythm. Have you ever noticed how a change in someone's pattern arrives before the explanation for it does? Roland had always been consistent about his schedule in a broad way, The brokerage had regular hours. He came home in the early evening on most nights, predictable in the way that people with established routines become predictable. But in the 6 months before February, there was a new consistency layered over the old one. He began coming home at intervals that did not match his calendar. Not dramatically late. Nothing that announced itself as a crisis. Precisely late. 15 minutes, 20 minutes, occasionally 40. The lateness was patterned in a way that suggested scheduling. Not traffic. Not a delayed meeting. The way a person is late who has built an interval into their day with intention. I noted the pattern without drawing a conclusion. I am not a suspicious person by nature. I am an observant one. I filed what I noticed and continued working. The second thing arrived in the mail. Roland had opened a credit card during an earlier period of shared finances, several years ago, when we had briefly consolidated some accounts, and he had never updated the billing address from my home office address. The card was in his name only, and had been for some time, but the statements were still coming to my address because billing address updates require you to remember that the old address is no longer current, and Roland had not remembered. The statement for the 2 months of January and December arrived on a Tuesday in February. I collected the mail in the morning, as I always did, because my office was at the back of the house near the entrance. I recognized Roland's name. I recognized that it was not a statement I had ever seen before. I set the rest of the mail aside and opened it at my desk. I read it once. Then I set it face down on my desk and sat for approximately 4 minutes without touching anything. The charges were hotel charges. The same property, both months, 6 times across the 2-month period. Dates that aligned. When I checked the calendar Roland kept shared with mine for logistics purposes, with the evenings he had been precisely late. Not every late evening. Enough of them. The hotel was not a place I had ever visited with Roland. It was not a brand he used for business travel. I knew his business travel patterns, his preferred properties, the reimbursement categories his brokerage used. I read the statement a second time. Then I went downstairs. Roland was in the living room. He had been working from home that morning, which I had known. He was reading something on his laptop. I saw him look up when I came in, and there was a half second before his expression settled into the ordinary greeting, a half second in which something else was there. I set the statement on the table. I aligned it with the edge of the table. I looked at him. He looked at the statement. He did not pick it up. Then he looked at me and said, "It was nothing. It's handled. We are not blowing up our lives over this." He said it in the flat, certain voice, the voice that had closed other conversations. He said it with the confidence of someone who had navigated similar moments before, the first incident, years earlier, and had found that sufficient calm and sufficient certainty could absorb what might otherwise be a crisis. He said it as though the saying were enough, as though the statement, delivered confidently, had the force of the credit card statement face up on the table. Evidence, conclusion, resolution. I looked at him for a moment. A very specific feeling arrived. Not anger, not grief. It was something colder and clearer than either of those things. The feeling of reaching for something in the dark and finding that your hand already knows where it is. The feeling of a structure that holds. I said, "All right." I went back upstairs. I did not go to the document box that evening. I have thought about this since, and I believe what I needed that evening was the particular stillness that you reach only when you have made a decision without needing to announce it. I sat in the back bedroom for a long while. The garden light came through the window in the way it does in February, low and gray and honest. I thought about 11 years. I thought about the first incident and the Thursday morning in Imogen's office, where we had both signed the documents, and Roland had asked his 2 questions and I had answered them. I thought about page 4. I called Imogen in the morning. I want to tell you about Imogen Haley, because she is important to this story, and she deserves to be described precisely. She was 50 years old, a family law attorney, and she had represented me originally when the postnuptial agreement was drafted. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Charleston, a harbor view office that smelled of paper and the dry, cool air of good climate control and something faintly older underneath, the smell of files. She was not a warm person in the social sense. She was a precise person, and in the relevant moment, precision was exactly what was required. When I called her, I told her what had happened. I told her about the credit card statement. She asked whether I had it in hand. I said yes. She asked me to come in at 2 o'clock. I did not go directly to Imogen's office. I spent the morning and the early afternoon gathering. There were other pieces available to me that I had noticed but not pursued, because I had not known before the credit card statement that there was a pattern to pursue. I went back through the shared calendar. The late evenings, the mismatch between calendar entries and actual return times, which I had noted with timestamps in my own calendar at the time without assigning significance. I checked the hotel's public website and confirmed its pricing and category. It was not a business traveler's hotel. I pulled 3 months of Roland's publicly available business filings, which I had access to through the brokerage's administrative systems. The hotel dates corresponded to no scheduled business event I could find. I had 4 pieces of documentation by the time I walked into Imogen's office at 2 o'clock. The credit card statement, the calendar annotations, the hotel property information, and a screenshot of the brokerage's event calendar for the relevant dates. Imogen looked at all 4 items. She read them the way she always reads things, quickly, without expression, from left to right. Then she said, "You confirmed the infidelity before calling me?" I said yes. She said, "That's sufficient." Then she said, "The postnuptial agreement. Do you have it?" I had brought the document box. She opened it. She removed the agreement. She turned to page 4 without being directed. She had reviewed this document herself, 8 years earlier. She had been the one who asked me to write the plain language summary. She knew the structure. She read page 4. She set the agreement on the desk between us and looked at me. I asked her what the clause's application meant in practice. She said, at $6.1 million, a 35% reallocation above the standard equal split means approximately $2.1 million shifts to your allocation. Your settlement allocation would be approximately $4.1 million rather than the standard $3.05 million. She said it quietly, in the specific tone of someone who has seen people surprised by their own signed documents before and has learned to deliver significant numbers without inflection. I sat in the harbor view light and thought about Roland's face when he had said it was nothing. I thought about the word nothing. Have you ever had a moment when a word someone used without thinking suddenly revealed everything about how little they understood? That word, nothing, had traveled from Roland's mouth to the relevant contractual language, and what it was worth had a precise number. I thought about that number. $2.1 million. He had said it was nothing. He had signed a document specifying what the word nothing cost. I left Imogen's office at 4 o'clock. Vivienne, my oldest friend, who had known me since we were both 22 years old in the same graduate seminar and who had been present for more of my life than anyone except Roland, drove me home from downtown. She had known only that I was meeting with an attorney, which was enough. She did not ask questions. She drove in the quiet that she has always known I sometimes need, and she let me out in front of the house, and I went upstairs, and I put the document box back on the shelf. I want to tell you about the day the postnuptial agreement was first proposed. Because it does not begin where you might imagine it does. It does not begin in Imogen's office, or in a lawyer's conference room, or even in a difficult conversation with Roland. It begins in my home office on a Sunday morning, approximately 3 weeks after I had confirmed the first incident and said nothing to anyone about it. I had a client deadline, a regulatory disclosure for a community bank in Georgia, 42 pages of mortgage documentation that needed to be restructured into a form compliant with new federal guidelines. I was working on it at my desk, the window light coming in cold and gray, early winter, the garden brown and quiet below. And partway through the document, partway through a section on what the bank was required to disclose in the event of a material change in the terms of the agreement, I stopped. I stopped because I was reading a clause about what happens when one party to a contract materially deviates from its terms without notice, about how the law provides mechanisms for the non-deviating party to seek remedy, about how these mechanisms exist precisely because contracts are documents, static, readable, interpretable, and not intentions which change and not feelings which cannot be enforced. I sat with that for a long time. The cursor on my screen stopped blinking because my hand had gone still on the keyboard. Have you ever had a professional moment cross into your personal life so cleanly that the boundaries simply dissolved? That Sunday morning was that moment for me. I was reading about financial protection mechanisms for bank customers, and I realized, with the specific clarity of someone who writes documents for a living, that I was a person who needed one and had not yet built it. Then I opened a new document and started writing notes. Not the postnuptial agreement itself. I was not an attorney, I was a technical writer, and I knew the difference. But the notes for a conversation I needed to have with Imogen. The structural elements of a protection that had a name and a procedure and a body of law behind it. I wrote the notes in the same plain language I used for client documents. Clear, specific, without ornament. Roland and I had dinner that evening, and I did not mention the notes. I had dinner the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and I scheduled the appointment with Imogen on a Wednesday morning and told Roland I had a client meeting. Which was not entirely untrue. I was meeting with a professional advisor about a professional matter. The document we eventually produced was a professional document. I simply happened to be one of its subjects. When I walked into Imogen's office that first time, she said, after I had explained the situation, calmly, in the order in which it had occurred, that she had seen this approach before. Not commonly, but occasionally. The postnuptial agreement as a prospective instrument, a structure put in place not in anticipation of divorce, but in recognition that a marriage that had experienced one breach was a marriage that had established a probability. She said, if you want this to hold, both parties need independent counsel, full financial disclosure, and genuine voluntary execution. No pressure, no deception about the terms. I said I understood all of that. I said I intended to tell Roland exactly what the agreement contained. I said I had written a plain language summary to make certain that was possible. She looked at me for a moment with the particular expression she has. Not quite a smile, not quite approval, something more like recognition. She said, you wrote your own plain language summary before coming to me. It was not a question. I said yes. She said she would review it and advise on the legal language needed to formalize each clause. We worked on the agreement over the course of 3 weeks. Imogen drafted. I reviewed the drafts and returned them with notes in the margins, the way I do with client documents, flagging anything that was ambiguous or that would not survive plain language translation. The fidelity clause went through 4 iterations before we had language that was specific, bilateral, measurable, and clear. Verified marital infidelity, not affair, not unfaithfulness, because those words are contested in litigation. Verified, with a definition of verification that could withstand examination. I brought the final draft to Roland on a Thursday evening. I told him I needed to talk to him about something serious, and he sat at the kitchen table and I put the draft in front of him and I explained, in ordinary language, what it was and why I was proposing it. I told him about the first incident, my confirmation of it, the specific way I had confirmed it, calmly and without drama, the way you present evidence when you want it heard rather than defended against. I told him that I was willing to continue the marriage and that this was the condition under which I was willing to do so. Roland was very still for a long time. Then he said he was sorry. He said it with what appeared to be genuine weight. I believed the weight was genuine. What I was less certain of was whether the behavior had been an exception or a pattern, and that uncertainty was precisely why the document existed. He agreed to retain independent counsel. He agreed to the terms. He agreed because he understood, in that moment, that the alternative was an immediate divorce proceeding rather than a prospective one, and the prospective arrangement offered him the benefit of the doubt in addition to the structure of a formal agreement. He took the arrangement that was offered to him because it was the better one available. He retained his attorney. He had the draft reviewed. He signed. Imogen told me later, in the weeks after the settlement conference, that in her experience, the people who sign postnuptial agreements without fully reading them are almost always the ones for whom the agreement was primarily a gesture of goodwill at the moment of signing. They sign because signing feels like reconciliation. They do not read because reading would require engaging with the possibility that the reconciliation might not hold. Roland had signed as a gesture of reconciliation. He had not read because reading would have meant taking seriously the possibility that he might repeat the behavior. He did not think he would repeat it. He was wrong about that too, the week before the settlement conference. Imogen and I met in her office on a Tuesday morning to go over the presentation of the documents. This was not, in her words, a strategy session. The strategy was complete. This was logistics. We were going to place specific documents in a specific order and allow them to do their work. She had printed 3 copies of the postnuptial agreement and 3 copies of the plain language summary. We went through them page by page, the way I go through a client document before final delivery, checking that every clause cited was legible, that the flagged sections were clearly marked, that the sequence of presentation would allow the other side to see exactly what they were looking at. On page 4, the fidelity clause was clear. I had written the plain language version of it carefully, 6 words at a time. The way you write something you know will matter. It had survived 4 iterations, a legal review, and an independent attorney's reading. 8 years later, it still held. The binder clip on my copy had left a slight impression in the upper corner of the cover page. 8 years on a shelf. Now it was the center of the table. Imogen looked at me across the documents and said, "You'll want to say as little as possible during the conference itself. Everything that needs to be said is on the page." I said I understood that. A good document does not require its author to explain it in the room. If you have done the work correctly, the document speaks. She said, "Then we're ready." Roland was not home yet. He came home at 6:30. He came into the kitchen where I was making tea and looked at me carefully, the look of a man assessing whether the previous day's conversation has settled into acceptance. I looked at him and said nothing meaningful. We had dinner. I went to bed at 9. Imogen filed the divorce petition 4 days later. Let me tell you about the 3 years that had passed between the first incident and the credit card statement, because they matter to understanding why the document existed at all. The first incident, 3 years into the marriage, had also been a hotel. Different city. A business trip Roland had taken that I had confirmed afterward had not been entirely business. I had found out through a particular combination of a forwarded receipt that came to my email by mistake. I was at that time still the administrative contact for Roland's business account, and a conversation with Dex, Roland's younger brother, at a family dinner some months later. Dex had said something with the particular carelessness of someone speaking about a matter he assumed was already known, a reference to Roland's situation in Atlanta with a small shrug, the way you shrug at something that has already been processed and filed. I had not reacted. I had understood, in that moment, 2 things. First, that the incident had been real and known and discussed within Roland's family. Second, that Roland's family had assumed it had been disclosed to me and resolved. It had not been disclosed to me. It had been discovered by me and, after that discovery, addressed directly and quietly by me in the conversation I mentioned, the one I had prepared for. Roland had, during that conversation, expressed genuine remorse. I had believed him, or I had believed enough of him, or I had decided that the structure of our life together was worth the terms of the postnuptial agreement I then proposed. We signed the agreement. I wrote the summary. We went on. Dex's shrug at that dinner had stayed with me. Have you ever watched someone accidentally confirm your worst suspicion without realizing they were doing it? That shrug was that. Not a wound, exactly, more as a data point. A piece of information I had filed and not discarded. The fact that Roland's family had known and had not questioned the resolution of it and had shrugged at it as Roland's situation. As if Roland's situations were a known category, a known pattern, that was useful to know. Not urgent, just useful. The kind of thing a precise person keeps. I kept it. The morning after Imogen filed the petition, I walked to the Battery before sunrise. Charleston in February has a particular stillness in the early morning. The harbor is dark and flat, and the houses along the water are quiet. And the salt smell is strongest before the heat of the day opens it up. I stood at the railing and looked at the water. What does it mean to have built a structure that holds precisely when you need it to? I have thought about that question many times since. It means you did the work before the emergency. It means you did not wait to be ready. It means you treated a contingency as a document and not a wish. I stood at that railing and thought about structure, about documents, about the particular kind of protection that is available to people who read carefully and write precisely and know where to find things in the dark. I thought about Roland in the living room doorway, the flat, certain voice, the confidence. I thought about page 4. Imogen's letter to Roland's attorney arrived the Monday morning after the filing. It arrived with the postnuptial agreement attached in full, and the relevant clause flagged with a plain yellow tab, the kind you use in document review, with nothing written on it. The flag was enough. The flag said, "Here." The letter informed Roland's attorney that we would be seeking application of the fidelity clause in the settlement, and included the documentation I had gathered, the credit card statement, the calendar records, the corroborating materials. Roland's attorney called Imogen back the same afternoon. He asked, in professional language, whether we would consider waiving application of the clause given the circumstances of an 11-year marriage and good faith reconciliation efforts. Imogen said no. She told me about this call that evening. She said she had delivered the no without elaboration, because elaboration would have suggested negotiation, and there was nothing to negotiate. The clause existed. The infidelity was documented. The application was straightforward. Roland called me directly that same evening. His attorney had advised against it. I found this out later, from a detail Imogen shared after the settlement, But Roland had always believed that he could manage things through conversation when the terms were face-to-face rather than on paper. That was his method. That was what had worked, or had appeared to work, in the past. He called my mobile at 8:40 p.m. And I answered because I had decided I would answer when he called, because I wanted to hear what he would say. He said I was being unreasonable. He said that the agreement had been written under different circumstances, that the intent of the agreement had been protective, not punitive. He said that he had addressed the situation, that it was done, that there was no reason to destroy everything we had built over one mistake. He said one mistake with the particular confidence of a man who did not know that Dex's shrug, years ago at a family dinner, was already in the record I was keeping in my mind. Have you ever listened to someone make an argument and known with complete certainty that every word they were saying was working against them? That is what that phone call was. I listened until he had finished. Then I said that I was not being unreasonable. I was being contractual. I referred him to his attorney, and I ended the call. I sat in the back bedroom for a while after that. The garden was dark. The February air came through the old window frames the way it always did, the particular cold that old Charleston houses carry in winter, the kind that does not respond entirely to heating. I thought about the word contractual. I had used it deliberately. I had wanted Roland to hear the word that described what was happening, not an emotional decision, not a revenge decision. A contractual one. He had signed a contract. The contract said what it said. I was proceeding according to its terms. Roland's attorney filed a motion to void the fidelity clause 3 weeks after the initial letter. I need to tell you about this motion because it was the moment at which the other side's strategy became clear, and because it was also the moment at which that strategy was revealed to have no foundation. The motion argued that the fidelity clause was punitive rather than compensatory, that its purpose was to penalize marital infidelity rather than to address a legitimate financial harm, and that punitive provisions in postnuptial agreements are unenforceable under general contract principles. The motion cited 3 cases in support of this argument. Imogen and I reviewed the motion together in her office on a Thursday morning. She read through it in the way she reads things, without expression, thoroughly. Then she looked up and said, "He cited 1 case from New York, 1 from California, and 1 from a 1987 federal district court in Massachusetts." She paused. None of them are South Carolina precedent, and one of the jurisdictions has substantially different postnuptial agreement standards than South Carolina does. Do you know the difference between an argument and a valid argument? One of them requires evidence from the right jurisdiction. The other one just requires confidence. Roland's attorney had delivered the latter. South Carolina courts enforce postnuptial agreements when they are voluntarily executed, when there has been adequate financial disclosure by both parties, when both parties had independent legal counsel, and when the terms are not unconscionable. The Moss agreement met every condition. Both parties had retained independent counsel. Both parties had signed. The financial disclosure was complete and documented. The terms of the fidelity clause were specific, measurable, and mutually applicable. It would have operated in Roland's favor with equal force if I had been the one to commit a verified infidelity. Mutual clauses are not punitive. They are bilateral. Imogen filed the opposition with the applicable South Carolina case law attached. The motion was denied. I was in my office when Imogen called to tell me. I was finishing a consumer disclosure summary for a mortgage servicer, a 15-page loan agreement that needed to be translated into plain language before the client's Monday deadline. She said the motion had been denied and gave me the court's finding in a single sentence. I said thank you and returned to the disclosure summary. I had 2 pages left. There was a brief period of quiet after the motion's denial. I kept working. I kept walking. February became March, and March in Charleston carries the first real warmth of spring. The jasmine begins, and the harbor light changes, and the city opens up slightly. The way it does. The way a person opens up when they have been holding something and finally set it down. I walked most mornings before I started work. I walked past the Battery, through the White Point Garden, sometimes up along the street that ran past the back of the South of Broad house, where I still lived, technically, though Roland had moved to a short-term rental in early March to reduce the daily logistics of a household in the process of dissolving. The house felt different with only me in it. Quieter, obviously, but also more specifically mine. I noticed things I had stopped noticing. The way the afternoon light moved through the second-floor hallway, the particular sound the piazza made in the wind, the smell of the garden in the early spring that I had not had occasion to stand still long enough to take in for some time. I had lived in that house for 11 years, and I was, in a way, meeting it properly for the first time. I kept the document box on the shelf. Roland's attorney made one further move before the settlement conference, and it was the one that has stayed with me the longest, not because it was threatening, but because of what it revealed about the thinking on the other side. The call came to Imogen, not to me. Roland's attorney asked whether Frederica would consider allowing Roland's signed copy of the plain language summary to be entered as evidence that he had not fully understood the fidelity clause at the time of signing. The argument, as Imogen relayed it, was that the plain language summary had been authored by Frederica, and that this created a question of whether Roland had received genuinely independent explanation of the terms, whether Frederica's authorship of the summary constituted a kind of influence over Roland's understanding. Imogen noted the following: the plain language summary's author was documented in the header as Frederica Moss. The summary had been prepared at Imogen's request, not Roland's. The summary's purpose was clarity, not obscurity. Roland's independent attorney had reviewed both documents before signing, and the argument that a document written to be maximally clear had instead confused its reader was not supported by the evidence. The request was withdrawn. Imogen told me about this exchange in the same quiet, precise tone she uses for everything. She said, "His attorney realized the argument confirmed your expertise rather than undermined it." She said this without emphasis, the way she says everything. But there was something in the air of that office. The harbor light through the fourth-floor window, the smell of paper, the postnuptial agreement lying open on the desk, that I recognized as the specific texture of a moment going exactly the way it should. I took the long way home from that meeting, past the market, down Meeting Street, around through the White Point Garden, along the Battery. The jasmine was full by then, that particular Charleston smell that lands on you in April like a change in altitude. I walked slowly. I thought about Roland's attorney withdrawing the request. I thought about the word expertise. I thought about the fact that the document Roland had failed to reread had been written by his wife, and that his attorney had briefly tried to use her authorship against her, and that the attempt had collapsed the moment anyone examined it directly. Some things you document because you hope never to need them. And then you need them. And the document holds. The settlement conference was scheduled for the second Wednesday in April at a neutral venue on King Street, a conference firm that handled mediations and settlement meetings, quiet and unremarkable, with a glass-topped table and 4 chairs and windows that let in the midday light. It was not a courtroom. It was not designed to be dramatic. It was designed to be precise. I arrived with Imogen. Roland arrived with his attorney. We sat across the table. I wore linen, the neutral linen I always wear, the wardrobe of someone who has stopped managing other people's impressions. I had brought nothing to the table except myself and the awareness that I knew what was in every document on it. Imogen set the postnuptial agreement in the center of the table, open to page 4. She set the plain language summary beside it, also open, with my name visible in the header at the top of the page. She aligned them. She said nothing while she did this. The arrangement was the statement. Roland's attorney asked, for the record, whether the fidelity clause was enforceable under the facts as documented. He asked it in a formal tone, the tone of someone fulfilling a procedural requirement rather than someone who expected a different answer than the one already delivered by the court's denial of the void motion. Imogen said yes. She cited the court's finding. She did it in a sentence and a half. There was a silence. I watched Roland look at the plain language summary. I watched him read the header. I watched him see his wife's name. He looked at his attorney. He asked, in a voice that was not the flat, certain voice, a smaller voice, a voice that was attempting to find somewhere to stand, "Is it enforceable?" His attorney said yes. Roland looked at the table. Then he looked at me. He did not say it was nothing. He did not say anything, actually. He looked at me. And then he looked at the table. And then he looked somewhere past my shoulder at the wall. The particular thing that went out of his face was not dramatic. It was the kind of deflation that happens when a structure is removed, when the frame that has been holding something upright is taken away and the thing sags into its actual shape. He looked away first. Do you know what it looks like when a man finally understands that confidence alone is not the same as being right? That is what it looks like. It is quieter than you'd expect. It is not a shout or a door slamming. It is a small collapse. A person becoming, in a moment, the correct size. The settlement was initialed at 6:14 in the evening. The allocation was $4.1 million to me and $2. $0 million to Roland. Against the standard equal split, the split Roland had expected, the split he had been calculating from the beginning, the clause had moved $1.05 million in my direction. In addition to the non-offending spouse premium built into the clause's structure, the total difference from what he had expected was significant. He had said it was nothing. The clause had said what nothing was worth, and Roland, who had signed the clause, had not known what he had agreed until his attorney said yes in a glass-windowed conference room on King Street on a Wednesday afternoon in April. I left the building at 6:22. Imogen walked me to the street. She said, "Well done," which was not something she said lightly. I said thank you. Then I walked home. I walked the long way, past the market, down the length of Meeting Street, into the White Point Garden, along the Battery to the water. It was April, and the jasmine was everywhere, that thick, sweet, specific Charleston smell that does not exist anywhere else in quite the same proportion. The harbor was calm. The light was going amber in the way it does in the early spring evening. The sun cutting sideways across the water, and the old houses along the street were lit up in it, all their particular shades of pale and pastel and worn white. I stood at the railing for a long while, not thinking about the clause or the numbers or the settlement, just standing in the city I had lived in for 11 years, which was, I was realizing, my city. Mine in a way that had not changed regardless of what had been signed or not signed in the conference room. I went home. I made tea. I put the blue-covered agreement back in the document box. I put the box on the shelf. There are things I want to tell you about the months after the settlement conference, because justice, when it finally lands, does not erase time. It accounts for it. It names it. But it does not give it back. Have you ever thought about what you would do with the quiet that comes after a very long fight? I found out. The South of Broad house went on the market in May. I moved to a rental in Harleston Village in late April. 2 rooms on the ground floor, a small garden out the back, the good kind of quiet that belongs to a space that is entirely your own. I painted the garden wall a particular pale clay color that I had always liked and had never been able to use because it was not the color of the South of Broad house's aesthetic. It looked exactly right in the Harleston Village light. I planted jasmine along the back fence. I went back to full-time freelance work in May. The first assignment was a consumer disclosure summary for a mortgage servicer in Charlotte. 15 pages of loan agreement language that needed to be translated into plain, clear English that the borrower could read and understand and sign with genuine comprehension. I finished it in 2 days. It was a good document. I know when a document is good. The structure is right. The language is accessible. The terms are specific and measurable and cannot be misread in either direction. I walked past the South of Broad house once, in August, before it closed. Early morning, from the Battery side before the heat of the day. I walked along the street and looked at it from across the road. The piazza was there, the narrow face of it, the old brick and the pale paint and the garden gate. It looked like what it was, a beautiful house in a beautiful city that had belonged to a version of my life I had documented carefully, and eventually, deliberately, filed. The blue covered agreement stayed with me. I kept it in the document box on the new shelf in the Harleston Village rental. I don't know precisely why. There is something about a document that has done its work, that has gone from a contingency to an actuality, that has sat in a box for 8 years and then been placed on a table and read, that makes it worth keeping. Some documents you keep because they represent what you built, and some documents you keep because they represent what held when the building came apart. I kept it. There is an emotional cost to this story that I owe you, because I said from the beginning that I would tell it properly. I lost Dex. Not through any dramatic rupture. There was no confrontation, no named break. Roland's brother, who had shrugged at Roland's situation years ago at a family dinner, who had confirmed without meaning to that the family had known and filed it under the category of Roland's manageable patterns, Dex sent me a single text message in June that said he hoped I was doing all right, and that he was sorry things had gone the way they had. He did not elaborate. I did not elaborate in return. We have not spoken since. I had genuinely liked Dex. I had liked his wife. I had liked the particular ease of the family dinners that were now simply no longer a part of my life. 11 years is a long time. It is long enough to build a specific texture of daily life that cannot be relocated, only replaced with a different texture. The tea in the kitchen in the morning with someone else in the house. The particular rhythm of another person's schedule organizing itself alongside yours. The way a shared calendar becomes, over 11 years, a kind of document of a shared life, entries that mean something only to the 2 people who put them there. I do not miss Roland, not specifically, but I notice the space where that texture was. I keep it in an honest inventory, along with everything else. The garden in Harleston Village is coming in well. Roland spent 8 years believing that a document he had signed, but not reread, had no consequence for him. He was wrong about that in a way that cost him $1 million and more, a loss that exists because I read the document. I wrote its plain language translation. I kept it in a fireproof box on a closet shelf, and I knew what verified marital infidelity and 35% meant in practice, even when he did not. The most powerful contract is the one both parties signed and only one party remembers. If you had been in that living room, dear listeners, if someone looked you in the eye and said it was nothing, it was handled, we were not blowing up our lives over this, what would you have done? Would you have said all right and trusted the document you had prepared? Or would you have said something that gave the game away before the time was right? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reached someone who has ever wondered whether what they signed will hold, share it with them. Because sometimes it does hold. Sometimes the structure you built in a quiet April morning, 8 years before you needed it, holds exactly when you need it most. Thank you for listening.